Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Surya Gangadharan. The Nathu-La battles of 1967 is barely a footnote in India's military history. The army doesn't talk about it, and it's mostly in the context of the 1962 defeat that any references to India's military conflicts are made. And really not clear why, because 67 was in many senses a victory for India. I have with me Probal Dasgupta. He is a former army officer and he's written a seminal book, one that I found unputdownable, frankly. Watershed 1967, India's Forgotten Victory over China. And this book came out very, very recently. We thought we'd talk to Probal about it. Probal, thank you and welcome. So why did you write a book of this kind, and does it flow from the army's own disinclination, refusal to look at 67?
Thank you, Surya, for having me over, and yes, and thanks for the kind words about the book. So the book started in the context of our looking at China. The narrative is, the discourse is driven from the fact that we look at China with a term of reference of 1962, and as you rightly said, that is where we position our thoughts from. In between, there was a period after 5 years that India and China went to battle in Nathu-La and Chola in the space of about 3 weeks. In both those battles, India had the upper hand and recorded victories over China. The one reason, amongst a few reasons that I've thought is possibly why we do not know about it, why it hasn't been spoken about or written about as much, is the fact that when we look at it as in terms of its context of that period, 1967 was just 5 years after 1962, and at that point of time, our understanding of China's strengths vis-a-vis our strengths, our self-confidence, our ability to dominate was very different from what we see today. And therefore, at that point of time, the news of India's victory was, they emerged as footnotes in certain newspapers at that point of time and they disappeared. It was never believed that India had had such a victory, a resounding victory in the space of 30 days over China. And that was also because of the leadership of one man, General Sagat Singh, who had taken the initiative to change the course of of Nathu-La and thereafter the Gurkhas at Chola. So that had happened. It had not been reflected much in the media. Also, somewhere India and China tacitly kind of seem to have agreed that not to reflect upon it too much out there in the open domain, given the fact that the more that you look at 1967, the more skeletons come out tumbling from the cupboard of 1962. The leadership had changed. The military leadership had changed, and that had been responsible for the victories of 67 and this was subsequently in 1971. The third reason why it was never out there in the public consciousness is also because of the fact that in 1971 we had recorded such a resounding victory that whitewashed everything that lay before it, including the victory of 1967. And that's also one of the reasons why it has taken a lot more time for us to even talk about the good performance that we had in 1965 in the war against Pakistan.
Because I find it strange, we talk so much about Kargil, In many respects, Kargil is a kind of a negative thing on India because we were caught with our pants down. We recovered and, okay, we did well in that sense, But when you look back, 67 in that sense was far better, We seem to anticipate things better. You mentioned General Sagat Singh, Again, he is not a guy who seems to have got much acknowledgement from his own army.
Yes, you're right. To begin talking about him, one of the things that had happened at that point of time, just to again go back to how we looked at China and how we looked at that entire set of battles, we called it skirmish. We've maintained that term over the years. We've called Nathu-La and Chola battles as skirmishes, and that's again a reflection of how we have looked at those battles. When these battles had happened, General Sagat had opened up the artillery, which the Chinese had not expected India to open up, which really rained a lot of rained cannons on the Chinese and really devastated them. That made a lot of difference. General Sagat's role subsequently in 71 was also quite seminal, given that he had taken an entire brigade across the river Meghna. All of that had happened. However, somewhere General Sagat's role has not been reflected as much. Maybe because he was also, if you look at his career, in 1961, he was the one responsible for taking Panaji and then Goa. But every time, he did not perhaps share the kind of relationship with his seniors at certain points of time, given that he was very instinctive. He was a military genius in the battlefield, which has been accepted across the military, across the domain in military history and understanding of military leadership capabilities. So he has been a leader par excellence. Somehow, because of the fact that he never shared a great rapport at all times, though he had effected results whenever he was called to lead the forces, whether it was in 61 in Goa or 67 in Nathu-La and Chola or 71 or even 69 in Mizoram. At every place he had really come out as a leader par excellence, but somewhere, given the fact that he didn't enjoy the kind of rapport that some of the other generals would have, possibly that's one of the reasons why he did not get the kind of spotlight that he should have in India's pantheon of military greats.
Some of the conclusions you've drawn in your book is that India's performance in 67 may have discouraged the Chinese from intervening on Pakistan's side in 71, despite a lot of American encouragement in that direction. Is that an accurate reading of Chinese thinking at that time? How do you say that?
Yes, that's a good question. Great question, Surya. In fact, there are a bunch of reasons why China didn't interfere. Some of the other reasons are quite well known in military history circles. One of the reasons was the fact that India had signed a treaty with the Soviets, which deterred the Chinese from really interfering at that point of time in 71. And the treaty also meant that 48 Soviet divisions were positioned against China along the border. The Chinese had also suffered heavy losses in a battle against the Soviets on the banks of Ussuri in 1969. So these were reasons that were well known. Amongst the other reasons that was not highlighted as much, and which is why I have said that this was also a significant reason, though underrated, that the Chinese did not even move an inch in Sikkim. Why I say that is because if you look at 65, just a few years before, China had no presence across Sikkim on their side. However, when Pakistan and India had gone to war on the Western Front, the Chinese forces had moved up against India across the Sikkim border. And that was, the reasons were twofold. One was to make India deploy on two fronts, and the other reason was also to possibly have a say in the barter of Sikkim vis-a-vis Kashmir. So that's a separate reason, separate subject altogether. But the fact remains that China had supported Pakistan earlier in 1965. In 71, despite the fact that the war was on the Eastern Front, and the Siliguri corridor, which we all know is about 25 kilometers wide at certain places, and the fact that Sikkim was not a part of India, it was a protectorate, which gave China immense, ample reason why they could have cut off India through the Siliguri corridor. And that also leads me to another little point as to which has been undermined in history, which is a tactical decision taken by General Sagat Singh in 1965, which led to India thwarting of any Chinese pressures subsequently and until today, because there was immense pressure on Indian Army to withdraw from the watershed passes at Nathu-La and Jelepla. And when the Chinese mounted pressure in 1965, Indian troops had withdrawn from Jalapala. Now that's a very debatable decision that was taken at that point of time, given that it gave the Chinese and withdrawal from Nathu-La would have also given the Chinese the space to occupy on Watershed and dominate India forever, even if they had not, and they would have found it easier to interfere in 1971. So these sets of events, which is General Sagat's decision in 1965 to stay put at Nathu-La despite the political and leadership pressure internally and Chinese pressure, and 1967 the battles kind of put the psychological ascendancy back in India's favor. So that changed many things. I mean, there was not even a pressure of any sort along the Sikkim border that China mounted in 1971.
So when you began work on this book, you zeroed in on Nathu-La. Were you looking at other battles also, or it just struck you that this is it?
So Surya, when you look at a subject, you are driven by the subject per se. But what happens in research is you are able to discover fairly significant several other nuggets and shards of incidents that you gather and form a string of a narrative that says a lot. And in this case, when I started looking at Nathu-La, I realized that the incidents, the events, so the period actually starts from 1965, 3 years after India's setbacks against China in 1962. Why so? It's because India had signed a treaty, had significantly embellished its equipment, and had changed its equipment, had raised additional divisions against Pakistan in 1965. So in 1964, all the refurbishment of weapons and strengthening of the army had happened. So and after the 1965 war, the pressure of China had increased, and there's several incidents that I could gather from 65 to 67, which included skirmishes, attacks on patrols, pressures, etc., which I felt was also significant in identifying what had happened pre-67 and why 67 is that inflection point when all these conflicts and skirmishes and battles and hostilities of any nature stopped forever.
So when you look back at 67 and you look at 2017 Doklam, you see kind of a flow from there. I mean, the way the Chinese responded then, and then 65 they kind of stayed quiet. 71 they didn't do anything, and then suddenly Doklam, it was near face-to-face standoff.
Right.
It was a very critical juncture.
Yes. So again, I go back to that the title of the book, Watershed, that kind of defines the way India has taken a stance against China. Thereafter, it changed the narrative, the India-China narrative. It restored parity in 1967, though it was a small victory, but it restored parity of a nature that had its impact on the standoffs that happened thereafter. And it's not just Doklam, it's Somdurungchu in 1986, Depsang, Chumar, Daulat Begoldi, Doklam. And if you look at these strings of the standoffs, it's Somdurungchu again, India had an upper hand, moved the troops quickly, which again caught the Chinese by surprise. Doklam again, India had an upper hand. So the template that was set by 67 has been used by India over a period of time, changing thus the narrative, the India-China narrative, and gaining a psychological advantage which it has maintained for over half a century. Also ensuring that though China is a more powerful force, it realized that it wouldn't be able to thwart India militarily so easily as it had in 1962.
Last question: how has the army reacted to your book?
Yes, I think I've had a good response from retired officers and people who have. So there are 2-3 aspects. One is I had interviewed people who former officers who had served during that time in Sikkim, who had participated in these battles, host of them. I have also spoken with serving officers and retired officers. They believe that this is a significant set of battles that should be highlighted. I've got a lot of encouragement from the armed forces when I was writing the book. And I've mentioned that as well. I had met the current CDS General Rawat at that point of time. He was very encouraging, and that was very helpful because it kind of enabled me to understand the right perspective when I spoke with people, the perspective of the defense forces, of the retired officers as well. So it's been taken well. I've got a lot of encouragement from the armed forces. Given the fact that it is one of the significant points of the book is that it highlights the declining claim strength of China in enforcing a resolution to disputes through hostile means. So when you look at what is that inflection point, that game changer, that watershed that changed the story, that changed the narrative, you go back to 1967, and I think we all recognize that, and I've got good encouragement from the army and in this regard as well.
So Probal Dasgupta, pleasure talking to you and looking forward to your next book. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Surya. Pleasure.